Hi, Susan Campfield here with SueCampfield.com. I'm excited to share with you today the two-tier eclipse technique. So I've got lots of tips and tricks for you and lots of different samples and different ways that you can take this technique and use it a variety of different purposes. So you do not need to use letters for this technique. However, that is very popular right now, so you'll see a lot of samples out there using the letter dies. So I'm going to go ahead and start with that, and then we'll explore some other options with using punches and different shape dies. So I'm going to start with a piece of Designer Series paper and get my letter dies. So because I'm not doing any stamping on this one, I'm just doing designer paper, we're going to go right to cutting out our letters. When you're using letter dies, you're going to be happier with your spacing if you put them closer together than you think they need to be, because the part that cuts is the center part of the die, not on the outer edge. So I want them, almost touching so that they'll be close enough. You also are going to be happier with your end results if your letters are straight and if they're lined up. So if you're nervous about them moving, if you're not using a magnetic platform like I am here, you might want to use a Post-it note just to hold everything in place before you send it through. So I've got those all lined up, and I'm going to put on my top plate and send that through. So I've got my letters cut out here, and I'm just going to set the Big Shot aside for now because I've done some pre-cutting on my other parts. Okay, so I also cut out, let's go back to this. Okay, so I'm going to take my dies off. I want to save the U, I want to save the O, and I want to save the middle of the O. If you're cutting a letter that has a middle, for instance like the letter B or P or R, make sure you save that middle portion. And then we're going to also push out our Y here. When you're dealing with designer paper, be really careful. Sometimes it can stick in your dies and might rip, so you want to be a little cautious with that. So I've got my U and I've got my letters cut out. As you can see, it's almost like a camouflage technique. There's some other things you can do with letter dies where you put a contrasting paper on the letters, and that's a really cool look, but it's not what we would call eclipse. Eclipse is where it's basically a tone on tone or the same on top of the other, and then you just have a little bit of a shadow effect around the letters. So let's talk about that shadow effect. To get the most prominent shadow effect, it's really helpful to cut out another set of letters. Typically I do 2 sets. So what I've done here is I've cut out the letters YOU again in navy, and then I have another set in navy. And what I'm going to do is adhere these together and attach them to my pattern paper. And to do that, I like to use liquid glue. So I'm just going to slide over onto my paper here so I don't get liquid glue all over my work surface. I like using liquid glue for this because it is, it's got that slide factor where I can slide my letter into place. You just want to be careful you don't get so much glue that you're oozing out. And now we're going to take our pattern paper Y and stick that on top. So I've got 2 navy cardstock pieces and then the one in the pattern paper. Now you do not need to you don't need to stack like this, but it will add quite a significant difference to your card. I am going to be putting a piece of mounting this on a piece of Night of Navy. So I am going to get some shadow from that, because I'm going to be popping my letters up on dimensionals here. So it's just, I'm going to get a more dramatic effect if I stack it, but you don't have to, and I will show you some samples where I didn't, I just did the single. So I'm going to adhere this to my paper, and I'm just going to show you what that Y would look like. Now when you're putting down your designer paper, you want to make sure you get some adhesive on these little bits and shapes around the letters. When I'm using the Y, I found that this part likes to pop back up if I don't put a little adhesive on it. So since it's so small, I'm going to use liquid glue for that. And then we'll stick that down. So there we've got our letters down. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stick my center of my O in there. The dies that I'm using, the inside of the O seems to be uniform, whether it's right side up or upside down, so it's pretty forgiving. You don't need to worry about it being exactly perfect. So I have seen cards where they pop up the center of the O. Personally, that's not my favorite because you want the letters to pop out. And so if you raise that inner part of the O, I think it makes it a little hard to see the O. So that it's personal preference. I prefer to stick it down. So then you're just going to take your adhesive. You can use foam strips, or these little mini dimensionals are just about the perfect size to stick on the back of your letters. And for the skinnier bits of your letter, you might want to use cut one of these in half and use a half a mini dimensional, like that. There we go. So I've got some dimensionals on there and I'm ready to stick that onto my project. I now have a half a dimensional stuck in my thumb. Oh, there we go, got it off. All right, so I'm just going to peel the backing off of here. And let me show you the difference or how that pops up. There we go. So that is the Tier Eclipse. So you've now got 2 layers or 2 tiers, and the eclipse would be the shadow of the navy that's showing through both in the base and also on the side of the letter because we stack some letters behind. So that's the basics on the 2-tier eclipse technique. Here's what the inside of this card looks like. Now let's look at some other ways to do this, and that would be stamping. So there's lots of probably the most common that I've seen for the 2-tier eclipse is using the letter dies and doing some stamping. So for this one, there's 2 different ways that you can do the stamping. You can stamp first and then cut, or you can cut first and then stamp. What are the differences or the advantages to one or the other? If you are wanting your images to be in a certain spot, like you want certain parts of the letters covered, then you're going to want to stamp after you cut. If you don't really care and it's kind of an all-over pattern, you can go ahead and stamp first and then cut. I would just say be very cautious that your letters are straight and even, and that you're not like smushing them over to one side to try to get them lined up with a stamped image, because you'll be able to tell. You'll be able to tell that that's what you did. So you'll be happier with the results if your letters are straight and even, unlike mine here that kind of go up. But that's another, I did this one in a hurry, so sorry about that. But this is what you would do to do your stamping secondary. And you would take your letters after cutting them, so cut your letters out first, and then basically you would stick them back in to the negative space and do your stamping. Personally, I like to put a post-it note behind, because if you're using a really sticky ink, when you lift up that stamp, that's all inky. Most likely those paper pieces are going to stick to it and they'll be falling in the ink and getting all over. So I like to just put a Post-it note on the back, sticky side up. These are black Post-it notes. And then stick my letters back in. That way I just know that they're going to be completely in the negative space and nice and flat and ready for me to stamp on. And then this way I can position my stamped images wherever I want them. If I have specific needs for my design, for my card, I can put them right where I want them. So if it doesn't matter, then you can stamp it first and then punch it out or cut out the dies. So let me show you the difference here of stacking versus not stacking. So this one I've stacked behind. So I've got 2 J's, 2 O's, and 2 Y's out of red cardstock, and they're glued behind the letters. This one I don't have anything. So it does add more dimension to put it behind, but it still is, it's still a nice card, a nice technique, even if you don't stack. It's just they pop out a little bit more if you stack behind. So let's look at some other options besides stamping, and then I've got a bunch of different samples of doing it some different ways. So let's talk about punching real quick here. So this is a card where I punched out an image and then I stamped. So we're going to go back to about, do I stamp before, do I stamp after? On this particular card, I didn't want to cover the kitty's face up with the flowers. So this one I did punch the kitty first, just like this. And then I put the cat back into the negative space with the Post-it note. I guess this one, my kitty's going the other way. I could flip it around if I wanted it on this side. Do it the same as my sample. There we go. And then I could go in with my stamp and stamp. Now with the punches, it's pretty tight to get it in here. And what I found is if you're using stamps that are orange rubber, for instance, an orange rubber stamp like this, you might get some kind of what we call a halo effect, just because of the little bit of a ridge when you put that back in the negative space. So here I've put it back in the negative space and I've stamped, and can you see right there, there's a little bit of a halo effect. It's not a big deal. Personally, it really doesn't bother me, and I don't think it's that noticeable. You can see here on the finished sample if you look really close. Didn't really get anywhere else, and these are outline images, so it didn't matter. It just happened to be on that one solid flower by the tail. It did show up a little bit. So that would be an instance where if I had stamped it beforehand and then punched, I wouldn't have gotten that, but I would have had to be very careful as to where I placed my flowers. I hope that makes sense. If you are using photopolymer stamps, which are the see-through ones like this, I found it doesn't matter. I don't get a halo effect. I think because they're a squishier surface, they tend to squish down in there and get it inked no matter what. So if you're using photopolymer stamps, it probably doesn't matter if you do it before or after. And then you would just, again, pop up your kitty, and I punched out 2 Night of Navy cats and adhere those to the back of the kitty for this one. So there's an example of using a punch instead of a die and using a shape instead of letters. And so I have another shaped one here. This one, again, navy and white. I love navy and white. This one with the star, and then I cut 2 navy stars out. They're mounted behind, and I stamped the spray of stars across. So just a very simple Christmas card. And then the other samples I have for you are letters. And I just want to jump back to the beginning when I was talking about spacing the letters. This is the first card I did. I've got a little Wink of Stella on here. And can you see how the YOU are spaced a little bit farther apart than I probably would have? It's just I was going off the outside edge of the die when I lined them up. And after cutting it, I realized, oh, okay, I need to put them together. Now this one I did stamp after I cut, because I wanted a leaf coming in on each letter, and I wanted to make sure I hit it, and I was being very picky on where I wanted my leaves to fall. So on this one I did stamp first, but it was a photopolymer set, so it did not leave any sort of halo to speak of. And then I did it in fall colors and even in some spring colors. I do like using the word you a lot. I like 3-letter words. I typically like 3-letter words that don't have any double letters, so that I can, it's just faster. I don't have to cut multiple of the same letter. So, so that's that one. Here's another one, again with you. It pairs up really well with, you know, celebrate you and thank you and just for you and all of those different greetings. So, and then I've got this one, which again I did do doubles on the letters, just because I wanted a Halloween card, and Boo, oops, I got a little mini dimensional wrapper on there. Boo fit really well on the card. So here's the inside of this one. And that is the 2-tier eclipse. So thank you so much for joining me today. Give this card a try. It's really fun to do. And again, you don't have to use letter dies. You can certainly use a shaped punch, or I'd just love to see your creativity and have a lot of fun with this one. Bye-bye.